May 24, 1940. Canal, France, 15 kilometers from Dunkirk. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian stood in the cupola of his command vehicle, binoculars raised toward the horizon. Through the haze of smoke from burning villages, he could see it, the English Channel, the beaches where 338,000 Allied soldiers were trapped, surrounded, cut off. 3 more hours of advance and the entire British expeditionary force would be captured or destroyed. The war in the West would be over. France would fall. Britain would be forced to negotiate peace. Germany would control Europe. Then his radio crackled. Orders from Army Group A headquarters. Halt! All panzer units stop immediately. No further advance. Hold current positions. Guderian couldn't believe it. His tanks had smashed through Allied defenses for 2 weeks. They'd covered 250 miles in 14 days. They'd done what German generals in World War I couldn't do in 4 years. They'd broken through to the sea, divided the Allied armies, and trapped the British against the coast. Victory was 15 kilometers away, 90 minutes of driving, one final push. But Guderian's tank commanders were already reporting the real problem. The problem that Hitler's halt order would be blamed for but wasn't the actual cause. Fuel gauges reading empty, tanks coasting on fumes, supply trucks 2 days behind the spearhead. The Panzers had outrun their logistics. They'd advanced faster than fuel could follow. They'd reached victory and stopped not because of enemy resistance, not because of orders from above, but because their fuel tanks were empty. What Guderian didn't know that May morning, what no German commander could have imagined, was that this moment would repeat itself 4 more times during the war. German panzers would reach the edge of victory, would be positioned to deliver knockout blows, would have the enemy trapped or the objective in sight, and would stop with empty fuel tanks. At El Alamein, 60 miles from Cairo. At Kursk, on the edge of breaking Soviet defenses. At the Meuse River, 5 kilometers from American fuel depots. Every time, the same story. German tanks reaching for victory and grasping nothing because they'd run out of fuel. Meanwhile, American tankers were learning to refuel their Shermans in 5 minutes flat using a captured German invention that Americans perfected and mass-produced. The jerrycan, a simple 20-liter fuel container that could be handled by 1 man and emptied into a tank in minutes. American tank crews carried 6 to 8 jerrycans strapped to their vehicles. When the main fuel tank ran low, they stopped, poured in reserve fuel, and continued moving. Total time, 5 to 10 minutes. No supply convoys needed. No waiting for fuel trucks. No operations canceled because fuel didn't arrive. This is the story of how fuel, or the lack of it, decided tank warfare in World War II. How German panzers designed for mobile breakthrough warfare became immobile steel boxes waiting for fuel that arrived too late or never came. How American tankers fought with the confidence that fuel would always be available because their logistics ensured it always was, and how German tank commanders watched victory slip away 4 separate times because they'd run out of fuel, while the enemy they'd nearly defeated was refueling and preparing to counterattack. Let me take you back to 1940 and show you how the most decisive weapon of mobile warfare became useless when the fuel tanks read empty. The German Panzer divisions that conquered France in 1940 were the most effective military force on Earth. They'd proven that mobile armored warfare could achieve in weeks what World War I's trench warfare couldn't achieve in years. The concept was revolutionary. Concentrate tanks in divisions rather than spreading them along the front. Use them as breakthrough weapons, smashing enemy lines and driving deep into rear areas. Move faster than the enemy could react. Destroy command centers, supply depots, and communication nodes. Force the enemy to collapse from paralysis rather than defeat from direct combat. The strategy worked brilliantly in Poland in September 1939, 19 days from invasion to victory. German panzer divisions had covered 250 miles and destroyed the Polish military before Britain and France could organize effective support. The success was so complete that skeptics in the German high command who'd questioned whether tanks could replace infantry and artillery were silenced. In May 1940, the same strategy was applied to France, but France was supposed to be different. France had the largest army in Europe. France had more tanks than Germany, many of them heavier and better armed. France had the Maginot Line, the most sophisticated defensive system ever built. France had Britain as an ally. German generals expected a long, difficult campaign. Instead, German panzers broke through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse River, and reached the English Channel in 10 days. It was the most stunning military victory in modern history. The French military, the British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian army, all were cut in half, surrounded, and defeated before they could organize effective resistance. By May 24th, German panzer divisions, commanded by Guderian and Rommel, had surrounded over 400,000 Allied soldiers against the coast near Dunkirk. This is where the fuel problem first appeared, though its significance wasn't immediately understood. Guderian's XIX Panzer Corps had advanced 250 miles in 14 days. The advance was so rapid that German logistics couldn't keep pace. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food all had to be transported by truck over roads that were often damaged or congested. The panzer divisions had raced ahead. The supply trucks crawled behind. On May 24th, Guderian's fuel trucks were 50 miles behind his tanks. The tanks had fuel for perhaps another 30 miles of advance. 15 miles to Dunkirk, 15 miles back if they needed to retreat, barely adequate for one final push. But there was no reserve, no margin for error. If the attack took longer than expected, if tanks had to maneuver extensively, if the British resisted strongly, the panzers would run out of fuel in the middle of battle with no resupply possible for at least 24 hours. Guderian requested a short halt to allow supplies to catch up. Army Group Headquarters agreed and issued the halt order that history would blame on Hitler's interference. In reality, Hitler's order was issued after Guderian had already stopped because his tanks were running on empty. The fuel situation forced the halt. Hitler's order just formalized it. For 3 days, German panzers sat 15 kilometers from Dunkirk, while fuel trucks made their way forward over congested roads. During those 3 days, the British organized Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk. Over 338,000 soldiers were rescued and transported to England. The entire British expeditionary force, which should have been captured or destroyed, escaped to fight again. The war that should have ended at Dunkirk continued for 5 more years. Guderian would write in his memoirs after the war that the halt at Dunkirk haunted him. He'd been 15 kilometers from ending the war in the West and was stopped by empty fuel tanks. He'd proven that mobile armored warfare could achieve decisive victory, but also proven that such warfare was completely dependent on logistics keeping pace. The Panzers were only as mobile as their fuel supply. The lesson should have been learned. Mobile tank warfare requires mobile fuel logistics, but the German military never solved this problem. Throughout the war, German panzer divisions repeatedly outran their fuel supplies. The tanks could advance faster than logistics could follow. This created a recurring pattern: rapid advance, fuel exhaustion, halt while waiting for supplies, enemy counterattack or retreat during the halt. Opportunity lost. 2 years later and 3,000 miles away, the same pattern repeated itself with more devastating consequences. June 1942, North Africa. General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the Afrika Corps, had just won the Battle of Gazala, captured the fortress of Tobruk, and was advancing into Egypt. The British Eighth Army was in retreat. Cairo, Alexandria, the Suez Canal, all were within reach. If Rommel could maintain momentum, he could drive the British out of Egypt, threaten Middle East oil fields, and potentially link up with German forces advancing through southern Russia. On June 30th, 1942, Rommel's forces reached El Alamein, a small railway station 60 miles west of Alexandria. Between Rommel and Cairo stood a demoralized British force hastily organizing defensive positions. British commanders were preparing to evacuate Alexandria. Plans were made to destroy facilities and withdraw toward Palestine. The British expected to lose Egypt. Rommel expected to capture it. He'd defeated larger British forces repeatedly. He'd broken supposedly impregnable defenses. His troops were experienced and confident. Cairo was 60 miles away. At the pace they'd been advancing, 2 days to victory, but Rommel's tanks weren't advancing. They were stationary along the El Alamein line, not because of British resistance, because their fuel tanks were empty. The Afrika Corps was supposed to be supplied by tankers sailing from Italy across the Mediterranean to Libyan ports. From there, trucks would carry fuel to forward units, but British submarines and aircraft were sinking the tankers. In June 1942, 50% of Axis shipping to North Africa was being sunk. The fuel that Rommel needed to continue his advance was sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Rommel's war diary from late June and early July 1942 repeatedly mentions the fuel crisis. July 1st, shortage of petrol is becoming critical. July 2nd, fuel situation prevents resumption of advance. July 4th, 3 tankers sunk, fuel allocation reduced by half, operations paralyzed. By mid-July, the situation was catastrophic. Rommel's panzer divisions had fuel for perhaps 20 miles of movement, not 20 miles per day, 20 miles total. After that, they'd be completely immobile. British commanders couldn't understand why Rommel didn't attack. They expected daily that German tanks would resume the offensive and crush their hastily organized defenses. They were preparing to retreat. Instead, Rommel sat stationary at El Alamein, not because he'd decided to wait, not because he was being cautious, but because he physically couldn't move his tanks more than a few miles without exhausting his fuel completely. Over the following weeks, the balance shifted. British reinforcements arrived from England and India. American Sherman tanks arrived from the United States. General Bernard Montgomery took command of 8th Army and organized comprehensive defenses. By August 1942, the British were stronger at El Alamein than Rommel. By October, they were overwhelmingly superior. The Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942 resulted in complete British victory. The Afrika Korps was driven out of Egypt, across Libya, and eventually out of North Africa entirely. Rommel would later write that the war in Africa was lost not at El Alamein, but in July when fuel shortages prevented him from advancing those final 60 miles to Cairo. He'd reached the edge of victory and been stopped by empty fuel tanks. By the time fuel arrived, the opportunity was gone. The British had reinforced. The moment had passed. The pattern was becoming clear. German tank forces could achieve rapid breakthroughs. They could outmaneuver enemy forces. They could reach objectives faster than anyone expected. But they couldn't sustain operations because fuel logistics couldn't keep pace with tank mobility. The Panzers were mobile warfare's perfect weapon, except when their fuel tanks read empty. Then they were immobile targets. July 1943, Soviet Union, Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk. This would be the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks and assault guns engaged over 2 weeks. The German plan was simple. Pincer attack from north and south, trap Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, destroy them, and regain initiative on the Eastern Front. The forces allocated were massive, nearly 1 million men. 3,000 tanks, including new Panthers and Tigers. The offensive had been delayed for months to wait for new equipment. When it finally launched on July 5th, 1943, German commanders expected victory. They didn't account for 2 factors. Soviet defenses were deeper and stronger than anticipated. The Soviets knew the attack was coming and had prepared the most extensive defensive system ever constructed. But more critically for this story, German tanks had a fuel problem that hadn't been fully appreciated during planning. The new Panther tanks, rushed into service for Kursk, had fuel consumption rates that were catastrophic. A Panther tank consumed 900 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers of movement. That's 9 liters per kilometer. The Panther's fuel tank held 730 liters, giving it theoretical range of 80 kilometers. But under combat conditions, with frequent maneuvering, acceleration, and running the engine for extended periods, while stationary, practical range was closer to 50 kilometers, Tiger tanks were slightly better. 540 liters per 100 kilometers, still twice what older Panzer III and IV tanks consumed. The German offensive at Kursk required tanks to advance, maneuver through defenses, fight through multiple defensive lines, and continue advancing for days. Fuel consumption would be enormous. German logistics planners calculated fuel requirements and established fuel dumps along the attack routes. Then Soviet aircraft destroyed the fuel dumps. On July 6, the second day of the offensive, Soviet bombers attacked German fuel stockpiles. Multiple dumps were hit. Thousands of tons of fuel burned. The flames were visible for miles. Panzer divisions that were supposed to be refueled from these dumps had to wait while fuel was brought forward from rear areas. The delay gave Soviet forces time to reposition reserves. By July 10th, German tank forces had penetrated deep into Soviet defenses but were consuming fuel faster than it could be replaced. Units reported fuel status critical. Some Panther battalions were immobilized, waiting for fuel trucks. The offensive continued, but the momentum was broken. Not primarily from Soviet resistance, though that was fierce, but from fuel exhaustion. On July 13th, Hitler canceled Operation Citadel. The official reason was that Allied landings in Sicily required German forces to be transferred to Italy. But operational reports from Kursk indicated that German tank forces were exhausted, had suffered heavy casualties, and critically were experiencing fuel shortages that prevented sustained offensive operations. Even if Hitler hadn't canceled the operation, fuel shortages would have forced a halt within days. Kursk was Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. From July 1943 onward, German forces were primarily defensive or conducting limited counterattacks. The strategic initiative passed to the Soviets permanently, and one factor in that German defeat was fuel. The most advanced tanks Germany produced consumed fuel so rapidly that sustained operations were impossible. The logistics system couldn't deliver fuel fast enough to keep the tanks moving. Now contrast this with American tank operations. American tanks in 1943 and 1944 had a massive advantage that wasn't immediately obvious from specifications. They had reliable fuel logistics. American tankers knew that fuel would be available. Supply failures were rare. When tanks ran low on fuel, trucks with fuel cans appeared, or the tanks refueled from jerrycans carried on the tanks themselves. American tank operations were never canceled due to fuel shortages. Never. The jerrycan deserves special attention because it represents both German innovation and American industrial superiority. The Wehrmacht introduced the Wehrmachtskanister, what Allies called the jerrycan, in 1937. It was a simple concept brilliantly executed. A 20-liter fuel container, rectangular for efficient stacking, with 3 handles so it could be carried by 1 or 2 men, with an air channel design that prevented glugging and allowed fast pouring. It was superior to every previous military fuel container. American forces first encountered jerrycans in Norway in 1940 and recognized immediately that they were far better than American fuel cans. The standard American 5-gallon can leaked, was difficult to pour from and often ruptured. American quartermasters obtained captured German jerrycans, studied the design, and recommended adoption. By 1942, American factories were producing jerrycans in enormous quantities. By war's end, America had produced 21 million jerrycans compared to Germany's 5 million. American tank crews used jerrycans as mobile fuel reserves. A Sherman tank carried between 4 and 8 jerrycans strapped to the exterior. Each jerrycan held 20 liters. 8 cans provided 160 liters of reserve fuel, enough for an additional 80 kilometers of travel. When the main fuel tank dropped below 1/4 full, the crew would stop, open the jerry cans, and pour the fuel through the tank's fill port. The entire process took 5 to 10 minutes. No specialized equipment needed. No fuel trucks required. Just stop, pour, continue. This gave American tanks operational flexibility German tanks never had. An American tank company could operate all day, refuel from jerrycans during a brief halt, and continue operating into the evening. German tanks had to wait for fuel trucks to arrive, had to establish refueling points, had to coordinate with supply units. The time difference was measured in hours. The operational impact was decisive. Let me tell you about one specific example that illustrates the difference perfectly. December 1944, the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in the West. The plan was audacious. Break through American lines in the Ardennes, drive to the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, split the Allied armies, force a negotiated peace. The offensive would employ Germany's remaining armored reserves, including the most powerful tanks Germany possessed: King Tigers, Panthers, and assault guns in numbers that represented the final concentration of German armor. But the plan had a fatal flaw that German planners acknowledged but couldn't solve: fuel. Germany didn't have enough fuel for the operation, literally didn't have it. Strategic fuel reserves were critically low. Refineries had been bombed. Synthetic fuel production was a fraction of requirements. The Ardennes offensive was planned with insufficient fuel from the beginning. German planners calculated that panzer divisions had fuel to reach the Meuse River only if they captured American fuel depots along the way. The plan's success required capturing enemy fuel to continue the operation. Think about that. Germany launched its last major offensive with a plan that required stealing fuel from the enemy to keep moving. Kampfgruppe Paper, commanded by SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, was the spearhead of the offensive. Paper's battle group included the newest King Tiger tanks, experienced SS troops, and orders to advance rapidly to the Meuse River. Paper was given priority for fuel. His vehicles were fueled completely before the offensive began. His route was selected partly because intelligence indicated American fuel depots were along it. The offensive began December 16, 1944. Paper's battle group smashed through American defenses and advanced rapidly. By December 17th, they'd penetrated 20 miles into American lines. By December 18th, they'd reached Staumont, over 30 miles behind the original front line. Paper was ahead of schedule. The Meuse River was 40 miles away. If he maintained pace, he'd reach it by December 20th. The entire Allied position in Belgium would be threatened. Then Paper's fuel ran out. His King Tigers, Panthers, and half-tracks had consumed fuel racing through the Ardennes. The fuel trucks that were supposed to follow him were stuck behind slower-moving traffic and congested roads. American forces had destroyed bridges, forcing detours that consumed extra fuel. By December 19th, Paper's fuel gauges read empty. 5 kilometers from Paper's position was an American fuel depot at Spa. Literally 5 kilometers, 3 miles. Paper could see the direction. His scouts reported the depot's location. It contained thousands of gallons of fuel, enough to refuel his entire battle group and continue to the Meuse. Paper couldn't reach it. His tanks didn't have fuel to travel 5 kilometers. He sent infantry to try to reach the depot on foot. American forces had already evacuated it, taking or destroying the fuel. For 3 days, Paper waited, hoping fuel trucks would reach him. They never did. American forces surrounded his position. On December 22nd, Paper received orders to withdraw, but his vehicles still had no fuel. Paper made the only decision possible: abandon the vehicles. On December 23rd, Kampfgruppe Paper walked back to German lines, leaving behind 73 tanks and assault guns, not destroyed by enemy fire, not damaged beyond repair. Abandoned because their fuel tanks were empty and no fuel was coming. American forces captured Paper's vehicles. They photographed them. The photographs show German tanks perfectly intact, simply sitting where they'd been left. Empty fuel tanks had stopped Germany's last offensive 5 kilometers from enough fuel to continue. American tank crews refueled their Shermans while advancing toward Paper's position. They stopped, poured jerrycans into fuel tanks, and continued. The Americans never ran out of fuel, never worried about it, never planned operations assuming they'd capture enemy fuel. They had fuel logistics that worked. The contrast in fuel availability was so stark that it borders on incomprehensible. In December 1944, American forces in Europe consumed approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel daily. Patton's Third Army alone used that much. The fuel came from tank ships crossing the Atlantic, from pipelines pumped under the English Channel, from trucks of the Red Ball Express. It arrived continuously in enormous quantities without fail. American commanders planned operations knowing fuel would be available. They allocated fuel by the thousands of gallons without concern about shortage. German forces in December 1944 were rationing fuel by the liter. Units received daily allocations calculated to the minimum needed for essential operations. Training stopped because there was no fuel for training. Reconnaissance was limited because there was no fuel for patrols. When major operations were planned, fuel had to be hoarded for weeks beforehand, stripping other units to create the reserve needed. And even then, as the Ardennes offensive proved, there wasn't enough. The mathematics were impossible. In 1944, the United States produced 4.7 million barrels of oil daily. That's over 747 million liters per day. Germany's total oil production in 1944, including synthetic fuel from coal, was approximately 5,000 barrels daily. That's 795,000 liters. Germany produced in a day what America produced in 16 minutes. The disparity was so enormous that no amount of tactical brilliance or operational skill could overcome it. German tank commanders knew they were losing the fuel war. Their vehicles sat immobile not from battle damage but from empty tanks. They watched American tanks maneuver freely, knowing the Americans never worried about fuel, while every German movement had to be calculated against remaining fuel. The psychological impact was severe. Knowing you have the better tank, the better training, the better tactics, but you can't move because you don't have fuel creates a sense of helplessness. After the war, American interrogators questioned German tank commanders extensively. A recurring theme in their testimony was fuel, not armor, not firepower, not American tactical superiority. Fuel. German officers spoke with frustration about operations canceled due to fuel shortage, about watching Americans advance while German tanks sat immobile, about knowing the enemy's weakness but being unable to exploit it because the tanks couldn't move. One testimony stands out. General Hermann Bauch, one of Germany's most successful panzer commanders, was interviewed extensively about German armored operations. When asked what single factor most limited German effectiveness, Bauch answered immediately, "Fuel." He explained that tactical skill and operational planning mean nothing if your tanks can't move. He described watching American units refuel and continue operations without pause while his divisions waited days for fuel trucks. He calculated that his units spent more time immobile waiting for fuel than engaged in actual combat operations. The most mobile warfare weapon in history, he said, became immobile for lack of fuel. The numbers support this assessment. Analysis of German Panzer Division operations in 1944 indicates that on average, units were fully mobile only 40% of the time. 60% of the time, they were either immobile waiting for fuel, conducting limited operations on reduced fuel allocation, or unable to respond to enemy movements due to insufficient fuel. American armored divisions, by contrast, were operationally mobile over 90% of the time. Fuel availability wasn't a constraint. It was assumed. Let me tell you one more story that encapsulates the difference. April 1945, Germany, the war is ending. Soviet forces are approaching Berlin from the east. American and British forces are advancing from the west. German forces are collapsing, not because they've stopped fighting, but because they can't move. Remaining German tanks sit in positions defending cities or roads. They don't maneuver. They don't conduct counterattacks. They sit in static positions and fight until destroyed, because they have no fuel to move. American tank units are racing across Germany, advancing 40 to 60 miles per day. They're not crawling forward fighting for every town. They're driving, sometimes for hours without encountering resistance, refueling from jerrycans while moving, stopping only when they encounter German units that haven't retreated because they couldn't. The contrast is total. American mobility against German immobility. American fuel abundance against German fuel exhaustion. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River, cutting Germany in half. The meeting point was determined not by operational plans, but by fuel logistics. American forces stopped at the Elbe partly because that was where Allied commanders had agreed to halt, but also because advancing farther would have extended supply lines beyond efficient fuel delivery distance. They could have continued. They had fuel. They stopped because the plan said stop, not because they ran out of resources. Soviet forces, meanwhile, had their own fuel struggles. Soviet tank armies had advanced over 1,000 miles from Stalingrad to Berlin. They'd done it with fuel supplied by American Lend-Lease oil and by captured German stockpiles. Soviet logistics were stretched thin. Unlike Americans, Soviets couldn't rely on unlimited fuel from domestic production. They had enough, barely, to reach Berlin. The final Soviet assault on Berlin in April 1945 almost stalled from fuel shortages before the city was captured. Germany had no fuel at all. The tanks that defended Berlin were positioned where they were when fuel ran out. They didn't retreat because they couldn't. They sat in place until destroyed or captured. The war ended with German tank forces immobilized by empty fuel tanks. After the war, studies were conducted analyzing why Germany lost. The conclusions pointed to many factors: Allied industrial superiority, strategic bombing, Soviet numerical superiority, American logistics. But buried in these studies is a consistent finding. German mobile warfare, the blitzkrieg that conquered most of Europe, was crippled by fuel logistics that couldn't support the operational tempo that German tactics required. The Panzers were designed to move fast and hit hard. They couldn't do either without fuel. And Germany never had enough fuel. The irony is that Germany understood fuel would be a problem. Hitler's entire strategy for expanding east was driven partly by need to capture oil fields in the Caucasus and Middle East. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the North African Campaign, both were influenced by oil considerations. Germany needed oil to fuel its war machine, but they never secured the oil fields they needed. Romanian oil fields provided some supply, but never enough. Synthetic fuel production from coal helped, but was expensive and vulnerable to bombing. By 1944, Allied bombing had reduced German fuel production to levels that made sustained operations impossible. The Americans had no such problem. They had oil in Texas, California, Oklahoma. They produced more oil than they could use domestically and exported millions of barrels to Britain and the Soviet Union. American strategic planning never considered fuel shortage a possibility. It was assumed that fuel would always be available. And it was. This assumption shaped everything. American tanks were designed without obsessive concern for fuel efficiency. They were designed for reliability, ease of production, and adequate performance. Fuel consumption wasn't a primary design constraint because fuel would always be available. American logistics doctrine emphasized delivering supplies in abundance rather than careful rationing. American training included unlimited fuel for exercises because teaching tank crews properly was more important than conserving fuel. German tanks were designed with fuel efficiency as a significant constraint. Operational planning included detailed fuel calculations. Training was limited by fuel availability. Everything was shaped by the knowledge that fuel was scarce and would remain scarce. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Fuel scarcity limited operations. Limited operations meant fewer victories. Fewer victories meant Germany couldn't capture the oil fields they needed. Lack of oil fields meant continued fuel scarcity. The story of tanks and fuel in World War II is ultimately a story about logistics determining strategy. The best tanks in the world are useless if they can't move. The most skilled tank commanders can't win battles if their forces are immobilized. Germany designed the best tanks, developed the best tactics, and trained excellent crews, but they couldn't fuel them adequately. America designed adequate tanks, developed solid tactics, and trained competent crews, but they could fuel them without limit. Given unlimited fuel, adequate tanks with competent crews will defeat superior tanks with excellent crews that can't move. That's the lesson. Logistics beats tactics. Supply beats skill. The side that can refuel in 5 minutes and continue operating beats the side that runs out of fuel in sight of victory. So when you think about tank warfare in World War II, don't just think about Tiger tanks versus Sherman tanks. Think about German tanks sitting immobile at Dunkirk, Alamein, Kursk, and in the Ardennes while their fuel gauges read empty. Think about American tankers stopping for 5 minutes, pouring jerrycans into fuel tanks, and continuing to advance. Think about Joachim Paper walking away from 73 perfectly functional tanks because he had no fuel to move them. Think about the mathematics. 4.7 million barrels daily versus 5,000 barrels daily. That's not a competition, that's a massacre by numbers. The Germans ran out of fuel in sight of victory 4 times. At Dunkirk, at El Alamein, at Kursk, in the Ardennes, every time they reached the edge of winning and stopped because their fuel tanks read empty. The Americans never ran out of fuel, not once. They refueled from jerrycans in 5 minutes and kept advancing. That's the untold story of tank warfare, not who had the better tank, who had the fuel to keep their tanks moving. And only one side did. If this story revealed how German tanks stopped winning because fuel tanks hit empty, while American tanks never worried about refueling, how 5 minutes with jerrycans beat the best tanks in the world when those tanks couldn't move, how fuel logistics mattered more than tank quality, then subscribe to War Rewind for daily revelations about World War II's decisive factors. Hit that like button if this changed how you understand armored warfare. Comment what shocked you most. German tanks stopping at Dunkirk with empty tanks, Paper abandoning 73 tanks from no fuel, or America producing in 16 minutes what Germany produced in a day. Tomorrow we reveal another asymmetry that decided the war. Until then, remember that the best weapon in the world is useless if you can't fuel it. Germany learned that lesson 4 times. It never stopped hurting.